Shadows of Z9. Hara's silent struggle. Hara's day began as all others, under the heavy oppression that defined life on Z9. Dawn barely brushed the dim sky, filtered by layers of polluted clouds. The small, cramped quarters where she and her daughter, Morera, lived offered no comfort, only a shadowy reprieve from the cold world outside. Inside, she moved silently, taking care not to wake her daughter or the looming threat in the next room. Her partner, Zesi, had once been her closest ally, but had long since become a figure of fear and domination, a tyrant she tiptoed around to protect her daughter and herself. Morera lay peacefully, her soft breaths in stark contrast to the tension that filled Hara's chest. This child, her innocent, beloved daughter, was her only light in the darkness. Hara watched her sleep, a moment of peace before reality shattered around them. In that silent gaze, she renewed her silent promise. They would escape. She would free Morera from this life. The sound of stirring in the next room snapped her out of her thoughts. She could feel Zesi's oppressive presence even through the walls, and she knew better than to delay. Preparing his breakfast with the precision of one who had long learned the ways of survival, she remained unseen and silent. Zesi emerged, his hulking form filling the kitchen. He barely acknowledged her, his presence a warning in itself. As he devoured his meal, Hara stood nearby, a ghostly figure, ready to obey but praying for escape. "Mama." A small voice, tender and half awake, cut through the silence. Hara's heart skipped. Morera, her bright eyes blinking against the morning light, hadn't yet learned the ways of their careful dance around Zesi's anger. Hara quickly moved to her daughter, scooping her up with gentle words, and hoped to keep her out of Zesi's line of sight. But Zesi's gaze turned to them, his glare a storm brewing. "Keep that brat quiet," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. The impact echoed through the room, amplifying his threat. Hara nodded quickly, her voice choked with fear, and led Morera to a quiet corner. She soothed her daughter with whispered words, doing her best to mask the turmoil within. Once Zesi left, slamming the door behind him, Hara exhaled, releasing the tension she had been holding in. As the house settled into silence, she knelt before Morera, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Are you all right, my love?" she whispered. Morera nodded, but her eyes held questions Hara couldn't bear to answer just yet. They clung to each other, Hara drawing strength from her daughter's innocence as much as she hoped her calm reassured her daughter. The day drifted in a haze of tasks. Hara cleaned, prepared meals, and looked after Morera, all while watching the door with a fearful heart. Each sound outside made her flinch, anticipating Zesi's return. She didn't know what would set him off next. She only knew she had to avoid it. As night fell, Hara tucked Morera into bed, singing a lullaby from her own childhood. The soothing melody was a fragile tether to a happier past. Slowly, Morera's breathing softened as she drifted into sleep. Hara remained by her side, gazing out at the few stars that pierced Z9's grim atmosphere. In their light, she found a small, flickering hope. One day, they would escape. One day, she would break free from Zesi's shadow. With this hope, Hara took her first real step towards escape. She knew that Z9 was a desolate planet for those without power or privilege, but she would find a way out. For Morera's sake, she would endure and fight, no matter the risk. And so, with a heart heavy with both fear and determination, Hara held onto her dream of freedom. She would ensure her daughter had a future far from the darkness they endured each day. A desperate hope, seeking freedom on Z9. Hara lay awake, listening to Morera's gentle breathing as the night deepened. Her mind was a whirlwind of possibilities and fears, each thought sharper and more desperate than the last. She knew this life was eroding them both, chipping away at her spirit and robbing Morera of her childhood. Zesi's cruelty had turned their small home into a prison. Tonight, more than ever, Hara felt the walls closing in, but she couldn't allow herself to feel trapped any longer. After confirming Zesi wouldn't return until the early morning, she slipped out of bed quietly, taking care not to disturb Morera. In the small dim room, she searched for anything they could sell, anything valuable enough to help them start anew. Her fingers brushed over a lockbox hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and she lifted it gently, trying to recall the last time she dared to hope it would be enough. Inside, a handful of credits glinted faintly, a meager amount, but everything she'd managed to save over years of quiet endurance. Hara's heart tightened with a surge of both dread and resolve. If they were to survive, she would have to make difficult choices. As dawn approached, she resolved to take the first risk and find a way off Z9. Early the next day, with Zezi still away, Hara led Morera by the hand, and together they ventured into the heart of Z9's dilapidated city. The streets were a chaotic blend of desperate vendors, beggars, and traders, all fighting for survival on a planet that seemed determined to swallow hope whole. She kept Morera close, shielding her from the harshness around them. Morera, clutching a worn stuffed animal in her small arms, looked up at her mother with eyes wide in curiosity, unaware of the true gravity of their mission. At the edge of the marketplace, Hara found herself before a shabby stall where rumors told her human smugglers sometimes gathered. She'd heard whispers from other desperate souls about smugglers who offered passage to those who couldn't afford to wait for justice or salvation. To find safety on another planet, Hara was willing to put everything on the line. A tall, rugged figure stood by the stall, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He looked her up and down with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Looking for something, miss?" he asked, his voice rough yet not unfriendly. Hara swallowed hard, her voice shaking only slightly. "I need a way off Z9, she said, her words barely above a whisper. "For me and my daughter." The man's eyes flicked to Morera, then back to Hara. He hesitated, perhaps taking in her desperation and worn-down appearance. Finally, he nodded and motioned her to follow him into the shadows behind the stall. In the dim alleyway, he leaned against a wall, crossing his arms. "There's a ship departing tomorrow night," he murmured, voice low. "It's risky and far from legal, but it can take you somewhere far from here. Safe enough." His words lingered, and she could sense the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Hara felt a small spark of hope ignite within her. How much will it cost? The smuggler's eyes narrowed, calculating. "Whatever you have," he said, his gaze hardening. "This is no charity, but it's a chance, better than most get around here." Hara held her breath, clutching the lockbox in her hands. She opened it carefully, revealing her meager savings. The smuggler glanced down, eyes appraising the small pile of credits. After a pause, he nodded curtly, snapping the box shut. "Be at the docks tomorrow, just before midnight. Bring only what you can carry, and don't speak to anyone." The words echoed in her mind as she returned home with Morera, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. As the day turned to evening, Hara spent her remaining time packing only the essentials. She chose clothing, a few cherished mementos, and enough food for a few days. Her hands shook with every item she tucked into their small bag, the weight of her choice pressing down on her as the minutes ticked by. She didn't know if they would make it, but the thought of a life away from Zezi's cruelty and the relentless suffocation of Z9's darkened streets filled her with a sliver of hope she hadn't felt in years. When night finally fell, she kissed Morera's forehead, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face as she slept. "My sweet girl," she whispered, her voice filled with a fierce love that defied the bleakness surrounding them. "I promise you, we're going somewhere better." As dawn broke, so did a new resolve within her. She kept a close eye on the window, her heart lurching each time a shadow passed. Hours stretched into an agonizing countdown until night finally came again. She dressed Morera warmly, carefully wrapping her small hands in woolen cloth and securing her belongings. Just before midnight, Hara and Morera slipped into the night, her heart pounding with every step they took toward the docks. The city was quiet, nearly empty, as they approached the looming structures by the shore. Towering ships lined the docks, their hulking forms barely visible in the low light. In the shadows, the smuggler waited, his expression unreadable. He gestured for them to follow him onto a rusty, battered ship that looked as though it had been pieced together from 100 different vessels. As they boarded, Hara glanced over her shoulder, feeling a strange pull in her chest, a final farewell to the place that had held them captive for so long. The ship's interior was cramped, filled with the hushed murmurs of others as desperate as they were. Hara found a corner for her and Marera, wrapping her arms around her daughter as the ship's engines roared to life. The floor vibrated beneath them as the vessel shuddered into motion, taking them further away from the nightmare they had known. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope as they left Z9 behind. Yet, as the ship drifted into the darkness of space, Hara couldn't shake a lingering unease. The smuggler's grim expression had hinted at challenges yet to come, and the silence aboard the ship felt charged with unspoken fears. She knew this journey would not be easy, but she was ready to face any trial if it meant a life of peace and freedom for Marera. As the stars stretched across the void around them, Hara held Marera close, whispering softly, "We're going to be all right, I promise." But as she spoke, she knew the path before them was fraught with unknowns. Even so, her heart remained steadfast, driven by a mother's love that no force in the universe could extinguish. Shadows in the void, the perils of escape. The ship's cabin was dimly lit, casting long, eerie shadows over the crowded interior. Hara clutched Marera tightly, her daughter's small hand nestled securely within her own. Around them, other passengers sat in silence, faces etched with a mix of hope and trepidation. For most, this journey was a gamble, a last, desperate attempt to flee the harsh lives they'd left behind. But as the ship jolted and swayed, Hara couldn't shake the feeling that they'd left one danger only to enter another. As they settled into the cold metal floor, Hara felt a pang of guilt for dragging Marera into this uncertainty. But the weight of Zesi's cruelty, the hopelessness of life on Z9, and the glimmer of a safer, brighter future propelled her forward. She brushed a comforting hand over Marera's hair, whispering softly, "Stay close, my love. We're heading somewhere better." The engines roared as the ship plunged deeper into the void, leaving the desolate planet far behind. Hara watched the small, circular window as Z9 shrank into a distant dot, a mere memory in the vastness of space. She exhaled slowly, letting go of the tension that had held her captive for so long. For the first time, she felt a taste of freedom, but a sense of foreboding still lingered. Hours passed, and the hum of the engines became a lullaby that lulled many passengers to sleep. Hara's eyes grew heavy, yet she forced herself to stay awake. She couldn't allow herself to fully relax. Something about the smuggler's quiet, distant demeanor unsettled her. They spoke little, exchanging glances but rarely addressing the passengers directly. The realization dawned that she knew nothing of their intentions or true destination. They were, in a way, captives once again. Suddenly, the ship lurched violently, jolting everyone awake. A low, metallic groan reverberated through the hull as if the vessel itself was straining under an immense weight. Hara instinctively wrapped her arms around Marera, who whimpered, clinging to her mother's side. Panic surged through the cabin as the passengers exchanged worried glances, voices rising in confusion and fear. One of the smugglers, a tall, wiry man with a scar running down his face, stepped forward, his face a mask of indifference. "Everyone, stay calm," he shouted over the noise, his tone firm yet devoid of compassion. "We've encountered a slight issue, but it's nothing to worry about." Hara's heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to protect Marera. The other passengers looked to the smuggler, their fear barely masked. She could see that many, like her, had no choice but to trust this man and his crew, despite the gnawing suspicion that they were at their mercy. As the smuggler turned to confer with another crew member, Hara leaned in close to Marera, brushing her daughter's hair back and speaking softly. "Remember, sweetheart, no matter what happens, I'll keep you safe." Merera nodded, her wide eyes filled with trust, a trust Hara silently vowed never to betray. The moments stretched into agonizing minutes, the tension thickening with each second. Hara closed her eyes, steadying her breathing, grounding herself in the warmth of her daughter's small hand in hers. Then, without warning, the lights flickered before plunging the cabin into darkness. A chorus of gasps and murmurs swept through the room as fear took hold, intensifying in the oppressive silence that followed. In the dim glow of emergency lights, the smugglers appeared like shadows, their faces obscured as they worked frantically at the control panels. Panic surged among the passengers, their voices rising as they demanded answers. Hara watched the smugglers' movements, noting the tension in their shoulders and the occasional exchanged glances filled with something close to dread. Just as she thought the situation couldn't grow worse, an alarm blared, a shrill sound that echoed through the ship and froze everyone in place. The scarred smuggler turned to face them, his expression tight and grim. "Listen up," he barked. "We've entered an uncharted asteroid field. We're going to maneuver, but it's going to be rough. Keep still and stay silent." As the ship's engines rolled to life, Hara tightened her hold on Merera, feeling her daughter's small frame tremble against her. The ship lurched and shook as it navigated the field, the lights flickering with each shudder. Hara could hear the thuds and bangs of debris hitting the hull, and her heart raced with each impact. Suddenly, the vessel was struck hard, throwing Hara and the passengers against the cold metal walls. Hara gasped, shielding Merera as best as she could, feeling a sharp pain flare in her shoulder from the impact. Around them, others cried out, clutching at one another or pressing themselves into corners, seeking some semblance of safety. After what felt like an eternity, the ship emerged from the field, and the tremors began to subside. The scarred smuggler cast a quick glance at the passengers, as though assessing the damage. "Everyone still in one piece," he grunted, his tone offering no comfort. The passengers nodded, murmuring reassurances to one another, but the air remained thick with unease. Hara's shoulder throbbed, but she ignored it, focusing instead on Merera, who looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes. "It's all right, my love," she murmured, forcing a reassuring smile. "We're safe." But even as she spoke the words, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her relief was fleeting, overshadowed by the gnawing realization that this was only the beginning of their perilous journey. The smugglers' true motives remained a mystery, and the path before them seemed fraught with danger. Hours later, after the passengers had begun to calm, a distant planet loomed into view through the small, foggy windows. Its surface was barren and desolate, a far cry from the vibrant world they'd been promised. Hara's heart sank as the smuggler announced their approach. "Welcome to Baron's Rest," he said, his voice laced with irony. "We'll be stopping here to make arrangements. Don't wander off." Confusion spread among the passengers as the ship touched down. This was not the destination she had envisioned. Hara felt the bitter taste of betrayal rise within her, her initial hope replaced by a sickening dread. But they were already here, already entangled in the smuggler's web, with no option but to move forward. Once on the planet's surface, the passengers were herded into a sparse encampment surrounded by towering cliffs and jagged rocks. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a gloomy gray. The smugglers moved with a practiced efficiency, directing each of them to a small, makeshift shelter that offered little comfort. Hara guided Merera into theirs, pulling her close as the reality of their situation began to sink in. That night, as Merera slept, Hara sat alone by the entrance, watching the shadowed landscape stretch before her, bleak and unwelcoming. The betrayal burned in her chest, yet she knew that she couldn't let it destroy her resolve. She had promised Merera a better life, and despite the obstacles, she intended to keep that promise. The chill of the night air cut through her thin clothes, but Hara barely felt it. Her mind raced, turning over ideas, plans, and faint hopes. She had no allies here, no one to turn to, but she wasn't about to surrender to despair. She had come this far, endured Zessie's torment, escaped Z9, and cross the stars, she would find a way forward. As the stars emerged overhead, their cold light casting faint shadows across the barren land, Hara took a steadying breath. She had come too far to give up now. Somewhere out there, beyond the cliffs and desolation, lay the freedom and safety she sought for herself and Narera. In the depths of the night, with the weight of their journey pressing down on her shoulders, Hara renewed her vow. They would survive. They would find their way. And in the face of every betrayal, every obstacle, she would stand firm, for Marera's sake, and for the life they both deserved. Survival on Baron's Rest, the price of freedom. The dawn on Baron's Rest was a dim, colourless affair, a pale glow that barely pierced the murky sky. Hara woke early, pulling her thin cloak tightly around her to shield herself from the biting chill that filled the makeshift shelter. Marera was still sleeping, her tiny body curled up beneath a threadbare blanket. Hara's heart clenched as she looked at her daughter, vulnerable and oblivious to the bleak reality outside. She stood, stretching her stiff limbs, and stepped out into the barren landscape. Around her, the other refugees and travelers were stirring, faces grim and weary. It was clear that many had expected better, hopeful they'd left Z9's oppression for a brighter world. Instead, they'd found themselves marooned in a desolate wasteland. But while the others exchanged fearful glances and whispered anxieties, Hara's mind was already calculating. She knew she couldn't allow herself to succumb to despair. She had to stay sharp for Marera's sake. At the edge of the encampment, she spotted the scared smuggler, his gaze fixed on the horizon, scanning the cliffs and open plains. He seemed restless, pacing with a wary vigilance that only increased her suspicion. Despite his rough appearance, he wasn't just any thug. There was a sharpness to his eyes, a guarded look that told Hara he wasn't a man to be trusted. Yet, he was the only one who seemed to know anything about this place. Swallowing her misgivings, she approached him. "You lied to us," she said, keeping her voice low but firm. "This isn't the safe haven you promised." The smuggler barely spared her a glance, his expression indifferent. "Plans change," he replied, a touch of sarcasm in his tone. "Besides, if you wanted a guaranteed paradise, you shouldn't have come to me." Hara clenched her fists, anger flaring in her chest. "We've paid you everything we had. We trusted you." A smirk played across his lips, though his gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon. "Trust," he said, almost laughing, "is a luxury, not a currency. You'll find that survival out here doesn't come free." "Then tell me what we're supposed to do now," Hara demanded, struggling to keep her voice steady. She felt the weight of Marera's presence, even from afar, pressing down on her. She couldn't afford to look weak. "How are we supposed to survive?" The smuggler sighed, finally looking her in the eye. "Look, lady, you're here now, and that means adapting. Food, water, shelter, all of it's limited here. The ones who survive are the ones willing to fight for it." He turned away, seemingly finished with the conversation, his disinterest an unspoken warning. "If you want answers, you'll have to find them yourself." Hara watched him walk away, frustration burning inside her. She knew she couldn't depend on the smugglers. She would have to find resources for herself and Marera. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and scanned the area. Her instincts told her the cliffs and the surrounding plains might hold resources if she dared venture far enough. Returning to the shelter, she found Marera awake, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Hara knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her daughter's face. "Marera, sweetheart, we need to be brave," she whispered. "We're going to explore a little, all right. I need you to stay close to me." Marera nodded, trusting her mother without question, her innocence a stark contrast to the desolation around them. They left the camp, venturing beyond the crude shelters and out toward the open plains. The landscape stretched endlessly, broken only by scattered rock formations and skeletal trees clinging stubbornly to life. The ground was dry and cracked, but Hara could see faint traces of greenery here and there, stubborn plants clinging to survival in the unforgiving terrain. As they walked, Hara kept an eye out for anything useful: small roots, edible plants, even water. She remembered the foraging skills her mother had taught her back on Z9, lessons she had thought she would never need. To her relief, they managed to gather a handful of wild tubers and some thorny fruits growing in the shade of a rock ledge. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She carefully placed the meager bounty in her bag, silently vowing to make it last. Hours passed, and they returned to the camp as the weak light began to fade. Around them, the other refugees eyed one another with a mixture of fear and hostility, tension simmering in the cold evening air. Hara could feel the desperation, the growing sense that each person was on their own. She knew it was only a matter of time before the flimsy threads of civility unraveled. That night, she and Marera huddled together, sharing the few bites of food they gathered. The thorny fruit was bitter, and the tubers were tough, but Marera ate without complaint, sensing her mother's resolve. Hara smiled softly, grateful for her daughter's resilience. "You're a brave girl," she murmured, kissing Marera's forehead. "Just remember, no matter what, we'll be all right." But as she whispered those words, a noise broke the quiet, shouts and scuffling from one of the shelters nearby. Hara's heart jumped, and she pulled Marera closer, straining to listen. The sounds grew louder, the clashing voices filled with anger and fear. She knew the reason without even having to see it. Supplies were scarce, and the desperation for food, water, or even a bit of comfort had driven someone to violence. The smugglers didn't intervene. They merely watched, amused or indifferent, as the camp's fragile peace shattered. Hara's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't let herself and Marera be drawn into the chaos. The situation was deteriorating fast, and she realized that staying here might prove as dangerous as remaining on Z9 had been. The next morning, Hara made a decision. She would find a way out of Baron's Rest, no matter what it took. She began to observe the smugglers closely, taking note of their routines, the paths they took between the camp and their own well-supplied shelter. Her gaze lingered on the small, battered spacecraft they'd arrived in, now docked a short distance from the camp. It was a long shot, but she had to consider every possibility. Over the following days, Hara continued her foraging expeditions, carefully rationing each bite for her and Marera. She avoided the growing groups in the camp, choosing instead to keep her distance and focus on her plan. As the nights grew colder and the situation in the camp became tenser, Hara's resolve hardened. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rocky horizon, she spotted a chance. One of the smugglers had left the ship to join the others by a fire, their laughter drifting on the cold night air. With Marera in tow, she slipped quietly toward the spacecraft, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt like a gamble, but she knew that hesitation could cost them everything. Reaching the side of the ship, she pressed herself against the cold metal, listening for any signs of movement inside. To her relief, it was silent. She carefully opened a side hatch, her movements quick and quiet, and guided Marera inside. The interior was sparse, but she spotted a small compartment filled with emergency supplies, food rations, water, a few blankets. It was enough to sustain them for a short journey if they could somehow find a way to fly the ship. Hara's knowledge of spacecraft was limited, but she remembered the basics from her youth, before Zessi had cast his dark shadow over her life. She moved toward the control panel, her fingers brushing over the buttons and switches. Anxiety gnawed at her, but she forced herself to focus. Just as she reached for the ignition switch, footsteps echoed from outside. Hara froze, her heart pounding as she looked at Marera, who stared back with wide eyes, sensing the danger. The hatch door creaked open, and the scarred smuggler's face appeared, his gaze filled with both anger and amusement. "Going somewhere," he sneered, his voice cold. Hara's mind raced, her body tense. She stood protectively in front of Marera, her resolve unbroken. "We need to leave," she said, her voice steady. "This place isn't safe." The smuggler laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the small cavern. "Safe," he mocked. "There's no such thing as safe out here. You'd best remember that. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. But you've got guts, I'll give you that. In that moment, Hara knew that if she was to survive Baron's rest, she would have to play the game on his terms, all while searching for an escape. She didn't back down, meeting his gaze with a fierce determination. I will protect my daughter, she said, her voice unwavering. Whatever it takes. The smuggler's smirk faded slightly, something almost like respect flickering in his eyes. Without another word, he stepped back, closing the hatch behind him, leaving them alone in the quiet of the ship. Hara released the breath she'd been holding, pulling Moreira into a tight embrace, heart pounding. They had been warned, but Hara's determination had only grown stronger. She had risked everything to find safety, and no matter what Baron's rest threw at her, she would find a way forward, for herself and for Moreira. Allies in the shadows, the seeds of a plan. The days that followed felt like an eternity. The camp on Baron's Rest was steadily unraveling. Tension and hunger twisted people's spirits, and desperation grew with each passing hour. Hara remained on high alert, watching over Moreira and keeping to the fringes, where fewer eyes followed. Her failed attempt to escape with the ship had placed her under the smuggler's scrutiny, but it hadn't shaken her resolve. In fact, her encounter with the scarred smuggler had only sharpened her determination to break free from this barren nightmare. But in the suffocating hopelessness of the camp, Hara's eyes had found an unexpected glimmer of light, a silent nod here, a subtle exchange of looks there. She realized she was not the only one seeking an escape. There were others, those who also seemed to yearn for something more than mere survival on this desolate planet. Over the next few days, Hara discreetly observed and noted these individuals, mentally cataloging each one. She'd seen the way they avoided the smuggler's gaze, the careful, guarded way they carry themselves. If there was any hope of leaving Baron's Rest, it would take more than her efforts alone. One evening, while gathering water from a small gritty stream that trickled through a rock cleft near the encampment, Hara caught sight of a woman with dark, piercing eyes and a quiet, determined expression. She had noticed her before, a reserved figure who kept to herself, but Hara had sensed a quiet strength about her. The woman approached Hara, casting a quick glance around to ensure no one was listening. "You're the one who tried to take the smuggler's ship, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Her eyes held a mixture of curiosity and respect. Hara hesitated, studying the woman's face before answering. "I am, but I couldn't get past the smuggler." The woman nodded knowingly. "You're not the only one with dreams of escape. I've been watching too, waiting for a chance. I'm Mira." She extended her hand, and Hara clasped it, feeling an unexpected spark of hope. "Hara," she replied, "and this is Moreira." She gestured to her daughter, who was crouched nearby, gathering small stones in her tiny hands. Mira crouched down, offering a small smile to Moreira before turning her attention back to Hara. "There are a few of us who believe we can make it off this rock, if we worked together." Hara's heart leaped. She hadn't dared to hope for allies in this place, but now the possibility glowed within her like a flame. "What do you have in mind?" Mira glanced over her shoulder, scanning the barren landscape before speaking. "There are supply runs scheduled every few days. The smugglers bring in food and other essentials, but they're also transporting off-world goods to fund their operations. I believe there's a way to leverage this. If we can gain access to those supplies, especially the energy cells they bring in for the machinery, we might be able to rig one of the smaller crafts to fly." Hara listened, her mind racing. It was risky, but the seeds of a plan began to take root. "Do you know when the next supply run is?" "Tomorrow night," Mira replied, her tone serious. "And there are others willing to help. There's a man named Tevin. He's an engineer from Z9, skilled in mechanics. He's been working with the smugglers to fix their equipment. He could be the key to getting us a functional ship." As they discussed the details, the pieces of a plan started to take shape. Tevin, Mira, and a few others would coordinate to distract the smugglers, while Hara would secure Moreira and any vital supplies they could gather. It was a fragile scheme, one that relied on precision and secrecy, but in this desolate place, it was their only hope. The following day passed in tense anticipation. Hara watched the smugglers carefully, memorizing their routines and noting the timing of their patrols. She kept a close eye on Marera, who sensed her mother's tension and clung to her side, her trust unwavering. Hara knew that Marera didn't fully understand the danger, but her daughter's innocent bravery strengthened her resolve. As night fell, Mira gathered the small group in the shadow of the cliffs. Tevin, a wiry, middle-aged man with grease-streaked hands and sharp eyes, nodded curtly at Hara as they huddled together, sharing last-minute details. The main craft's control systems are locked, but there's an older model hidden in one of the hangars. It's barely operational, but if we can power it with the energy cells, it should be enough to get us off this rock, he explained in a low voice. Mira handed Hara a small, battered flashlight and a few ration packs. For Marera, she murmured, casting a glance at the child who stood nearby, clutching her mother's hand. If anything goes wrong, we split up. Make your way to the eastern cliffs and try to stay hidden. There are rumors of hidden caves that may offer protection. Hara nodded, her grip tightening around Marera's hand. We'll do whatever it takes. As they moved quietly toward the hangars, Hara's heart hammered in her chest. The faint glow of the smuggler's fire flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Mira and Tevin moved swiftly, positioning themselves near the smuggler's camp, while Hara stayed in the shadows, inching toward the supply crates stacked along the hangar's edge. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the campfire. Mira had kicked a rock into the fire, scattering embers and creating a burst of confusion. The smugglers jumped to their feet, shouting and cursing as they tried to stamp out the small flames that had caught on the dry ground. Taking advantage of the chaos, Hara darted forward, securing a crate filled with food and a bundle of energy cells. "Let's go," Mira hissed, motioning for the others to follow. They moved swiftly, skirting around the hangars and slipping into the small, hidden craft Tevin had identified. Inside, Tevin worked quickly, attaching the energy cells and murmuring instructions to Mira. Hara sat with Marera in the cramped cockpit, her heart racing as she held her daughter close, whispering soft reassurances. The ship's systems flickered to life, a low hum filling the cabin as the engines struggled to stabilize. Tevin's brow furrowed with concentration as he adjusted the controls, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Outside, the smugglers had noticed the commotion, their voices growing louder as they searched the area. "Now or never," Tevin muttered, flipping a switch. The engines roared louder, filling the small space with a deep vibration. Hara braced herself, holding Marera tightly as the ship began to lift off the ground, its hull shuddering from the strain. Just as they cleared the hangar, a shout rang out from below. The scarred smuggler stood in the doorway, his expression a mask of rage as he realized their escape. He raised a blaster, aiming it at the ship's thrusters, but Mira was quicker, pulling a lever that sent the ship lurching forward just as a blast of energy zipped past them, narrowly missing its mark. Hara's heart thundered as the ship ascended, breaking through the thin atmosphere of Baron's Rest and into the open void. The landscape below shrank, the camp and smugglers disappearing into the distance as they soared higher. Relief washed over her, and she felt the weight of Baron's Rest fall away, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. In the cramped silence of the cockpit, Mira looked back at Hara, her expression softening. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and triumph. But even as the tension began to ease, Hara knew their journey was far from over. They had escaped the smugglers and the desolate prison of Baron's Rest, but the unknown stretched out before them, vast and uncertain. She looked down at Marera, who was gazing out the window with wide, curious eyes. As she held her daughter close, Hara silently vowed that no matter what lay ahead, she would continue fighting. This was only the beginning of their journey, and she would see it through to the end. For Marera, for freedom. Through the stars, the bonds of survival. The small ship trembled as it broke free from Baron's Rest's weak gravitational pull, its aging thrusters barely keeping pace with the demands of space travel. The cabin was dimly lit, casting an eerie glow over the faces of those who huddled in silence, too exhausted or too stunned to speak. Hara kept her arm wrapped protectively around Marera, feeling the steady rise and fall of her daughter's breaths. This frail craft was a cocoon of hope, their first real step toward freedom, but Hara knew that their journey was still fraught with peril. Beside her, Mira and Tevin exchanged quiet words over the console, their expressions tense as they monitored the ship's systems. The ancient craft was far from optimal, gauges flickered, and the hum of the engines was punctuated by unsettling groans and creaks. Tevin adjusted a dial, his face tight with concentration as he muttered a string of technical terms to himself. "How long until we reach a safer system?" Hara asked, breaking the silence. She could see the strain etched into Mira's face, a reflection of her own worries. Tevin glanced back, his brow furrowed. "If these coordinates are accurate, we're about 2 days from the nearest station that might take us in, if we can hold out that long." This ship was barely space-worthy, even before we pushed it past its limits. He cast a concerned look at the console, where warning lights flickered ominously. "We're going to need a lot of luck." The words settled heavily in the cabin, a reminder of the thin line they were walking between hope and desperation. Hara's gaze moved from Tevin to Mira, and then to the other refugees who had joined them on this fragile escape. Each face was etched with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. They were united in their plight, bound by the shared hope for a better life, yet Hara sensed that tensions lay just beneath the surface. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional murmur between Mira and Tevin as they adjusted the ship's controls. Hara tried to rest, her body weary, but her mind was a relentless torrent of thoughts. She glanced down at Marera, who had drifted into a restless sleep, her small hands clutching her mother's sleeve. Watching her, Hara felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. Whatever happened, she would keep her daughter safe. Just as she felt her own eyelids growing heavy, a sudden, piercing alarm shattered the stillness. Hara jolted upright, her heart racing as Tevin sprang to the console, his fingers flying over the controls. The ship's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cabin as Mira moved to assist him. "What's happening?" Hara called out, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Tevin's face was grim as he read the data on the screen. "We've got a breach in one of the secondary airlocks. It must have been damaged during takeoff. If we don't seal it, we'll lose pressure." A murmur of fear rippled through the passengers, their faces pale in the dim light. Mira's gaze was steady, her voice calm as she spoke. "I'll take care of it," she said, unbuckling herself and standing. "Tevin, can you monitor the pressure levels?" Tevin nodded, his face tense. "Be quick, Mira. We can't afford any delays." Hara felt a surge of admiration as Mira moved toward the back of the ship, her movements confident and precise. Despite the risks, Mira had proven herself a leader in this small, fragile group. As she worked, Hara focused on keeping Marera calm, whispering reassurances as the child's eyes flickered open, filled with confusion. "It's all right, my love," Hara murmured, stroking Marera's hair. "We're safe, just a little problem with the ship." After several agonizing minutes, the alarm finally ceased, and Mira returned to the cabin, her face flushed but triumphant. "It's patched up for now," she announced, earning a collective sigh of relief from the others. "We should be good to go." Hara watched as Mira settled back into her seat, her strength and resilience an inspiration. It was remarkable how quickly bonds could form in times of crisis, and she felt a newfound sense of camaraderie with these strangers who had become unlikely allies. As the hours stretched into the next day, the ship glided through the empty vastness of space, the silence broken only by the occasional click of buttons and quiet exchanges between Tevin and Mira. Hara's mind wandered, drifting between worry for their immediate safety and thoughts of the future that lay beyond the stars. She imagined a world where Morera could run freely, unburdened by fear, surrounded by friends and kindness. The image gave her strength, and she held it close, a shield against the uncertainty that lurked in every flickering light and every groan of the ship's aging metal. By the second day, exhaustion and tension had settled heavily over the group. The rationed food was barely enough to sustain them, and water was dwindling faster than anticipated. The refugees exchanged uneasy glances, the quiet desperation building into an almost palpable force. Hara felt it too, the gnawing hunger and dryness in her throat, but she forced herself to remain calm, setting an example for Morera. Suddenly, the ship's sensors beat, drawing everyone's attention to the main console. Tevin leaned forward, frowning as he studied the screen. "We've got something incoming," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Mira's face paled. "What is it?" "Another ship." Tevin shook his head, his fingers flying over the controls. "No, it's debris. A whole field of it. The sensors didn't pick it up until we were almost on top of it." The realization sank in quickly. There was no time to change course. The ship jolted violently as they plowed into the debris field, metal scraping against metal as fragments of rock and wreckage battered the hull. Hara clutched Morera tightly, bracing herself as the ship shuddered under the impact. "Hold on," Mira shouted, gripping the sides of her seat as Tevin fought to stabilize the craft. The passengers clung to whatever they could, faces pale with fear as the ship pitched and rolled. Hara's heart hammered in her chest, each impact sending a fresh wave of terror through her. After what felt like an eternity, the ship finally broke free of the debris field, emerging battered but intact. Tevin slumped back, his face drenched in sweat as he let out a shaky breath. "We're clear," he said, his voice hoarse. "But we took some damage. We're losing fuel fast. I don't know if we'll make it to the station." Silence fell over the cabin, a grim acknowledgement of the dire reality they faced. Hara felt the weight of their predicament pressing down on her, but she refused to give in to despair. She looked around at the faces of her fellow passengers, saw the fear in their eyes, and felt a surge of resolve. "If there's a way to reach that station," she said, her voice steady, "we'll find it. We've made it this far, and we won't give up now." Mira nodded, her eyes fierce. "She's right. We've come too far to turn back." Their determination ignited a spark among the others, a shared understanding that they would push forward, no matter the odds. Together, they adjusted their course, conserving fuel and rationing their remaining supplies with a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, after countless hours of silence, tension, and uncertainty, the distant shape of a station appeared on the view screen. It was small, unassuming, little more than a collection of metal modules floating against the backdrop of stars. But to the weary passengers, it was a beacon of hope, a promise of rest and safety. As they approached, the station's docking lights flickered on, guiding them in. Hara held Morera close as the ship made its final descent, feeling the familiar, blessed sensation of gravity as the ship connected with the docking port. The air was filled with a collective sigh of relief, the weight of their journey finally lifting. Stepping onto the station, Hara felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and wonder. Around her, the refugees murmured in awe, gazing at the station's sterile walls and clean, white lights. It was far from the paradise they had dreamed of, but it was a sanctuary, a place to start again. As they walked down the corridors, Mira moved to Hara's side, her expression softening. "We wouldn't have made it without you," she said quietly. "You kept us together." Hara shook her head, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "We all kept each other going. This is only the beginning, Mira. We're finally free." With Morera's small hand tucked safely in hers, Hara walked forward, feeling the promise of a new life within reach. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream of a future unburdened by fear. She was ready to face whatever came next, certain that together they would find a place to call home.